The great thing about short literature is that the author refuses to expand beyond what's necessary. There's a kind of disciplined economy in the writing. But sometimes we want to actively dive deep into a subject, and that's where a great thick tome comes in. The challenge with something like a big book is, of course, the fact that the author had spent years and years of their life working on this problem of the book. And it's probably a contention with a whole range of connecting problems. And you, the reader, are supposed to come in what feels like a lengthy span of time for you to read is actually a small blip in comparison to the length of time to write that work. And the author has to somehow convey that problem to you, that conundrum that they were struggling with that felt necessary to write down on the page. So I decided to grab a bunch of large books off of my shelves. And what I specifically want to look at is how much does the author manage to capture the thematic seed of the overarching work within that small opening, that little window that they have at the beginning to grab your attention. What are the techniques that the author's employing to try to instill that sense of the greater work? And some of these books I've read before and some I haven't. And so you're going to get a mix of my reaction to the thing anew, of how much does it give me an impression of the overall work without having read it yet. And then also maybe I can look at some works that I have read and we can think, how accurately does this convey what the feeling of the rest of the work is going to be? This is inspired directly by a kind of tag that's going around called the Quick to Judge Challenge, but more specifically, Steve Donahue's variation on it, where he took a bunch of Mammoth books and then just looked at the beginning and just discussed what he found in that opening portion of the text. So I'm going to do the same. And I hope really that it just helps you find some books, but also ends up being a demonstration of how I read and how I think while I'm reading. Because every book, via just the physical weight, feels like a long-term commitment. And so there is a battle over your attention that the author has to succeed in. And that battle begins on the opening pages. So that's what we're going to look at today. The first book I want to show you is one that I actually learned about from a fellow booktuber, Grix. And we're probably going to read this book later this year. So I'm kind of excited to see how it opens. And I'm curious what sense it gives me for the rest of the work. The book is The Sociology of Philosophies by Randall Collins. And as you can see from the subtitle, it says, A Global Theory of Intellectual Change. What this book seems to attempt, unlike a lot of other philosophical overviews, is instead of treating the ideas as isolated in the mind of major figures, it's trying to think of it as a web of influences and connections. And so from what I understand, this book goes over thousands of lesser-known thinkers in the history of philosophy, and the ways that through interaction with other philosophers, they contribute to the deeply social phenomena of philosophical discourse. It's taking the angle of not treating philosophy as this eureka-bound heroic enterprise with individual, each a paradigm shift of themselves, but rather this gradual wave of overlapping and turbulent force underlying philosophy itself. A kind of interaction of status competitions rather than merely rational discourse. In many ways, it seems to be a precursor for a lot of what's going on in humanities, which is an emphasis on data analysis across networks. And so this book is trying to give an alternative to the typical view of philosophical history. I hope that it ends up not just serving as a reminder of some of the philosophies that I've probably forgotten, but hopefully a strong introduction to many voices that have otherwise subsided or been lost across time. Let's see how well this book actually presents itself from the outset. Intellectuals are people who produce decontextualized ideas. These ideas are meant to be true or significant apart from any locality and apart from anyone concretely putting them into practice. A mathematical formula claims to be true in and of itself, whether or not it is useful, and apart from whoever believes it. A work of literature or of history claims the same sort of status, insofar as it is conceived as art or scholarship, part of a realm that is higher, more valid, less constrained by particular occasions of human action than ordinary kinds of thoughts and things. Philosophy has the peculiarity of periodically shifting its own grounds, but always in the direction of claiming or at least seeking the standpoint of greatest generality and importance. This continues to be the case when the content of philosophy is to assert that everything is transient, historically situated, of local value only, for the relativistic statement itself is asserted as if it were valid. This is an old conundrum of the skeptical tradition, discussed at great length in Hellenistic philosophy. Skeptics, in attempting to avoid making assertions, implicitly stand on a meta-distinction among levels of assertion of varying force. This illustrates the sociological point admirably, for only the intellectual community has the kind of detachment from ordinary concerns in which statements of this sort are meaningful. So as you can tell from the writing, this isn't exactly an introductory text. It just sort of dives in and assumes that you're already familiar with certain terms and, in particular, in this case, certain ways of formulating sentences. It starts with that opening line, intellectuals are people who produce decontextualized ideas. And from the outset, it's like this absolute essentialist statement about what intellectuals are. And then I immediately think of contradictory examples, like I think an engineer would be considered a kind of intellectual, and they certainly live in a grounded space that isn't decontextualized, although they are relying on decontextualized concepts. So I can certainly see some of the merit there of what this author is talking about. It seems to me that from that very opening line, he's sort of setting a tone of distance in the abstraction of philosophical thinking. And because this is a sociological work, it's clear to me that at some point he's going to have to zoom in on the material grounding for those intellectual ideas. So I would assume he's actually critiquing that distance that philosophers take. I mean, he starts off with a sociological technique just by defining intellectuals not by what they say of themselves, but by their function, what they do. Intellectuals can be known via their action, is essentially the statement undergirding this initial one. And when he brings up how these ideas are true or significant, apart from any locality, he's identifying a central tension involved with almost any use of language, which is that language generalizes necessarily. That's part of what makes it so communicable. But as soon as you generalize, you are distancing from something local. And so that tension is always going to be there because so much of the use of philosophy is supposed to actually have some kind of tether to real truth, to something that is existent in the world or of the world. And if the language itself distances immediately, well, that's a tension that is hard to resolve. It's almost a paradox in that intellectual ideas seem to claim universality while arising from highly specific social contexts. In the case of this book, I imagine it's going to be looking at the social context of each individual thinker in the ways that their ideas don't just emerge wholesale from their mind. It's often influenced by the culture surrounding them and the time and space in which they live. So that very particular environment then blooms out into the idea that then spreads across person to person to person. So that's just interesting in just the first two sentences. We have this kind of critique of the distance of philosophers, a reminder of the ways that philosophers speak in abstraction, but also a reminder of the ways that that is an inherent contradiction or paradox, because they do live embodied. They do live in a space and in a time. And even the language that they use will be interpreted via that space and time. Already, like the first two sentences are at least intriguing, and I wonder if that is that seed in this initial opening page of what might be to come, of a kind of criticism of that level of abstraction. I do like the little point that he makes halfway through the paragraph. He says, "This continues to be the case when the content of philosophy is to assert that everything is transient, historically situated, of local value only." What I like about that statement is he's essentially talking about himself, right? So he's trying to bring philosophy down to the level of groundedness and away from abstract generality. But even when you do that, just like the very opening sentence of this paragraph, you end up making a general claim, right? So even the relativists, certain kinds of relativistic arguments, end up making general claims about relativism applied wholesale across the board. The fact of it being relative is itself an absolute claim of what is. And so he is also doing that in that very opening sentence. He's making a broad claim about intellectuals and how they make broad claims. I hope that he's aware of that kind of irony. It seems like he is, because he is bringing up, even when philosophers try to move away from broad claims, they end up falling back onto broad claims. And again, maybe that is just a limit of the language itself. So at least in this opening paragraph, we're getting an author who seems at least somewhat self-aware of that challenge in philosophy. And then this final sentence of this illustrates the sociological point admirably, for only the intellectual community has the kind of detachment from ordinary concerns in which statements of this sort are meaningful. In this moment, he's returning to that sociological framework of planting the seed for an extensive analysis for how material conditions and network structures end up shaping abstract thought. Because philosophers want to find some deeper truth, and then that deeper truth itself is couched in language, and of course it ends up being fully abstracted. It's away from the concerns of daily living. And it sounds like a light criticism that he's throwing in, but it's almost an unavoidable one, because how can you speak to anything being generally true without seemingly vying to remove yourself from the only thing that you actually know, which is your local conditions? So that's going to be a paradox that's always going to be there. So in this opening paragraph, it does feel like at least we're getting a taste of some of the thinking that Collins is potentially going to have. He's trying to deal with the paradoxes within abstract thought and the groundedness of those who create that thought. He's trying to establish a sociological scaffolding for the philosophy that follows, because he himself is doing philosophizing while he's discussing these philosophers and attempting to describe and delineate them from a distant view. But of course, he is in the midst of that as he's doing that work. I do appreciate that he's, at least in this opening paragraph, establishing a kind of conceptual tension of universal claims versus social situatedness. And that is a nice reality of any kind of intellectual work. Like, even anytime I'm sitting here trying to talk, I'm making all kinds of generalizations. There's always going to be a hasty extrapolation to every kind of generalization, because we ourselves as speakers are always highly limited, and we are pulling from other speakers who are all highly limited, and yet we're always making grand claims. Like just right now I said always, and that is of course completely superlative, that use of that word always, but it's an easy thing to slip into. I hope that this book actually lives up to the challenge he's almost posing to himself at this opening, of not just sitting back on abstraction and distance and actually honing in on realities of detail and individuals and the facts on the ground as much as possible. Of course, one critique that comes to my mind as I imagine this sort of project, this project of mapping out the intellectual networks of influences, is I do wonder, is that really the way of understanding how ideas emerge? When I think about the ideas that I have, of course, a certain portion comes from the writers that I'm reading or the thinkers who exist nowadays at this particular point in time. But there's also a kind of stochasticity to some of the things that emerge in the moment. Like when I'm sitting here talking to you, there's so much that I'm saying that is as unexpected to me as it is to you. It's that abundance that emerges out of the tension of time, of having a kind of imminence in the statement of a sentence, that makes it so that so many of the ideas really are just a kind of eureka, a kind of inspiration. And so if we can map out within data all of the facts on the ground, all the things that can be known because it's written down or because it is solidified in some way, it is giving us confidence of knowing the source of something, when really so often the source of what emerges is really quite mysterious and strange. And there's going to be a continual strangeness when you're open to really observing what it is that's happening when an idea occurs. And this book is going to use data, and it's going to give that confidence of data. But I do think we should always be wary of confidence from data. Sometimes it's going to be limited. It has to be. I'm sure that he knows all that. I don't want to act like it's like such a profound thought to criticize that. I'm sure he's going to do the work. And I'm excited to actually get to this really crazy, hefty book, The Sociology of Philosophies by Randall Collins. It's going to be a big one. I'll read it later this year. Maybe I'll get back to all of you on how good it is. But this is the first massive tome that we're looking at. Let's go move on to the next one. That kind of philosophical abstraction also ends up in a lot of, especially postmodern literature. There's one that came out not too long ago called Invidicum by Michael Brodsky. And I've been hearing about it quite a bit. Leaf by Leaf recently did a video on this book, a quite lengthy video on the book. From what I understand, this book, Invidium, is going to try really hard to capture the linguistic complexity and isolation that emerges out of that complexity. It's going to be using language and the double and triple entendre aspects of language use that makes it so binding in so many ways. It's going to be an experimental novel defying conventional structure, a kind of hyper object that defeats typical notions of representation. At least that seems to be the goal here. Inviticum, the title, is the name of a drug in the story that these test subjects are being administered. And this test drug has something to do with the level of envy that they experience, and I don't know how the story develops from there. From what I understand, it's going to be highly intellectual and distant and precisely as abstract as what was being described in the prior work that I just covered. Let's see how it begins and see if it gives us that sense of density that we would hope for with a postmodern work like this. For trial subject 1, Martin Eden, a far from perfect day for walking over the bridge, from Middah Street to the Amygdala Institute. The silvery rash below mirrors expertly the lability of his own forever adolescent skin, adding insult to injury, premature ejaculation of the toothpaste down the drain, with not enough remaining to kill the afterstench of dream-free sleep. Could be taken for an omen, but why be lashed to the mainmast of mumbo-jumbo? Such a malevolently sunny morning's been created specifically for men, like one's bullying father, with an obscene zest for life. Yet, like a true snake, it has elected to give its unjustifiable all to somebody like him, purely to taunt said somebody's inherent inability to savor. An injustice, this, very much on the order of, say, Bush Cheney Rumsfeld's toddling off to die entwined in the same bed of roses after having regretlessly sent thousands of kids to their death in what was once called Mesopotamia of all places. Beautiful-souled Eden is obliged to concede that the scum is managing yet again to inherit the earth. He tries to saunter up summer smoldering Essex Street, more of a grand boulevard if you ask me, while at the same time dodging the flip-floppers with their tattooed fedoras and remaining hyper-alert to the one psychotic out of 1,000 who might just decide to stab him in the neck simply for staring cross-eyed or refusing to. And with this thought in tow, he is suddenly too weighed down even to limp, much less saunter. Okay, we're getting a lot of subjectivity of this initial character, Michael Eden, which I think that's the name of a novel by Jack London, Martin Eden. So we already immediately get a literary reference, although I haven't read that novel, so I don't actually know what that means to use that character's name. But it opens with trial subject 1, Martin Eden, and his name is in parentheses. So there's already a distancing from him as a person. And even later on in the paragraph, they refer to him as one instead of by his name. So I'm guessing that feeling of alienation or separation is going to be prominent in the rest of the novel if they're already trying to kind of disconnect us and treat him as not as a subject, but as some kind of objective object that's going to be tested upon. And then beyond that initial dehumanization, we have an almost extreme wading back into humanness with that line, the silvery rash below mirrors expertly the lability of his own forever adolescent skin. It's certainly a choice to use the word lability in that sentence because that typically refers to emotional instability, which is a mental state, but it's being used to describe his adolescent skin, his forever adolescent skin. And so there's this weird unsettling mind-body connection happening just in that second sentence. There's also like a sexual connotation with lability, like labia. And then in the next sentence that gets reinforced with the premature ejaculation of the toothpaste down the drain. So there's like this provocative, bodily function oriented, in line with the daily minutia of toothpaste emerging out of a tube. I'm getting the sense that a lot of this it's describing this Martin Eden character, but also focalizing around his sense of the world. So maybe he is a libidinal, carnal, kind of simple fella with a very negative view of the world, a kind of nihilistic view, which does seem to be reinforced a bit later when it says, could be taken for an omen, but why be lashed to the mainmast of mumbo jumbo? And so that is this tension between meaning making and absurdity in that line, because he's saying it could be taken for an omen. In other words, I could derive meaning from this whole thing, but instead I would consider the very act of deriving meaning a kind of temptation, And we know that he views it like a temptation because he's talking about being lashed to the mainmast of mumbo jumbo, so meaning as mumbo jumbo, and being lashed to the mainmast, that would be a reference to the Odyssey, with him being lashed to avoid the siren's song. I guess it's giving us the sense of he has like a nihilistic view of meaning, that it is just something that we employ out of a kind of satiation as opposed to something that actually exists in the world. Meaning being something that we need to resist. And then that kind of negative view then gets reinforced in the next sentence, which is, such a malevolently sunny morning's been created. So malevolently sunny. So we have this kind of malicious agency being attached to what is otherwise often considered poetic and beautiful, the sun's shine. Such a malevolently sunny morning's been created specifically for men like one's bullying father. And again, there's that dehumanizing distance, calling him one instead of calling him Martin Eden. So his father, one's bullying father with an obscene zest for life. So we're getting this father-son conflict in this little moment, but also kind of a paranoid worldview of like just pure negativity. It's like, oh, look, this is all designed for a certain kind of person, like my bullying father. And so it's obviously not designed for that. Ironically, the prior sentence was all about shirking meaning, but now he's actually enforcing a very paranoid meaning onto what is otherwise quite a positive thing. And of course, that can happen quite a lot when people claim to be critical, but what they end up portraying is just cynicism. And that seems to be what he's doing here. He's not really taking a truly careful nihilistic view of like, oh, it's just a fact that there's no meaning. No, he's actually just forcing there not to be meaning by enforcing just a negative view of things, which of course is actually enforcing a meaning. Yet, like a true snake, it has elected to give its unjustifiable all to somebody like him, purely to taunt said somebody's inherent inability to savor. So we have this next sentence about yet like a true snake. So the snake is like the snake in the Garden of Eden, tempting Eve to eat the apple of knowledge. And so that biblical serpent imagery is sort of implying like a curse upon this protagonist, like his inability to savor, his inability to enjoy himself. So maybe that connects to a major set of motifs throughout the rest of the work of pleasure and suffering and inability to enjoy oneself. And that's perhaps why they're taking this drug. I mean, we already get a character who seems like he's embedded deep within envy in the sense of being incapable of just enjoying the world. And so often cynicism is like a kind of envy of other people's enjoyment. So you're just trying to crush it down. And he just seems to be trying to crush down meaning and enjoyment for the sake of some other internal pleasure of just feeling superior to things. And so maybe that's in this opening paragraph giving us a sense that, oh, he's the perfect subject for this experiment to take away feelings of envy with the drug Inviticum. It seems like we're just being set up with just this dark contrast of negativity to the potential shift into a more positive outlook for this Martin Eden character. But I don't know. I haven't read the book yet, but we'll see. There's some jokiness with the Bush Cheney Rumsfeld. So now we get that first little bit, not the first bit of linguistic play, but a very obvious bit of linguistic play. Like literally instead of Rumsfeld, it's Rumpsfeld. So it's just, again, that kind of cynical adolescent attitude. I just had the thought that it brings up his forever adolescent skin, the thing wrapping his body, but what is really forever adolescent is seemingly his way of thinking. With you have these words like Rumpsfeld, so deliberately misspelled. It's like kind of texturally playful. And then again, we have a reference to beautifully sold Eden, which the typical biblical phrase that would come to mind is like the meek shall inherit the earth. But we have in this sentence that the scum is managing yet again to inherit the earth. So that's again reinforcing his cynicism. He tries to saunter up summer smoldering Essex Street. So we have a very specific place, but it's being mixed in. That specificity is being mixed in with some surrealness, while at the same time dodging the flip-floppers with their tattooed fedoras. And obviously tattooed fedoras is a surreal detail. We can't literally have a tattooed fedora. So we have this physicality of like a specific place, and then we have just the full absurdity of that phrase, tattooed fedora. Perhaps it's like a way of signaling how consistently this protagonist seems to warp reality into some kind of twisted view of it. And so his subjectivity is always clamping on and just making things worse. Tattooed fedora. It's just sort of like this flatness occurring. And then it ends with, and with this thought in tow, he is suddenly too weighed down even to limp much less saunter. And this feeling of being weighed down, he blames on the world. But of course, it's obviously coming from himself. So what we have in this opening is a character trapped within their own cycling inner over-analysis. And via that over-analysis, they really are just blaming everything around them for what is clearly self-imposed. It certainly gives me a feeling of like paranoia. There's a little bit of linguistic play. There's this kind of weight of consciousness of like, if only we could shut off our thoughts for a little while. And I'm guessing that that's going to become a major thematic point of this book, is how much thoughts can be so imposing. And it's a bit of like a play in the actual form of the book too, because since the book is going to be linguistically dense, it itself is an example of the very thing that its characters are suffering through, which is their constant interpretation and overinterpretation of things and ruining the joy of living by always analyzing it. And this book itself is analyzing everything. I imagine that some of you, when you heard that paragraph, you probably found it quite stale and distant and strange and overly dense and perhaps not quite poetic enough. It's missing some of the beauty of what prose can accomplish, but maybe that's purposeful in the sense of it actually mimicking that feeling of that subdued, muted quality of living where you can't just experience the world anymore because you're always questioning it. I don't know that this is like the most enticing opening paragraph, but it at least is consistent with what seems to be the theme, which is a kind of intellectual binding that might be happening with various characters and the ways that we just consume ourselves with our own kind of misery. So that, again, was In Vidicum by Michael Brodsky, and now on to the next massive tome. This next book should feel completely different from the last one, and this is The Garden of Seven Twilights. And what this is it's a bit like the Decameron in that it's a collection of stories, but unlike the Decameron, which is a collection of stories that are only really thematically bound by the days in which the characters are telling their stories, this one seems to have the stories nested within each other in ways that are directly related to the history of the space that the characters are in. It's actually supposed to be read in order, not scattershot. Decameron you can read out of order and still get a lot of enjoyment out of it. There's a disconnection between a lot of the stories in the Decameron in terms of literal relationship, but there is at least a consistency more in tone with the Decameron. But with something like The Garden of Seven Twilights, from what I understand, it is a book that tries to use these stories in a fractal way where they each represent each other from big to small to big, and they connect overall into a broader picture. At least that's seemingly what I understand of the book. I haven't read it yet. It has a nice little description on the front. It says, this book is a Borgesian apocalyptic Decameron that begins in bombed out Barcelona. So let's actually see how it opens and how it conveys that tree of tales that it's eventually going to embark upon. Okay, so I see here this is a pretty lengthy opening paragraph. During the first atomic strike in its history, Barcelona became a hecatomb. Apart from the panic and disbelief, what was most astounding for those like myself who were able to indulge in a bit of reflection was to see the way the life of the city and the country, organization and order, the dictates of custom, all the things that ordinarily appear as obligations, collapse over the course of a few days, as if we had been living over an immense pus-filled abscess, simply waiting for the touch of a lancet to make it explode. Two opposing phenomena were the principal causes of the chaos. First, the starving, bleeding avalanche of Frenchmen, mostly Frenchmen, though there were Englishmen and Belgians also among them, survivors from their own countries, where disaster seemed already to have struck. By the time it occurred to anyone to try to get them under control, they had overwhelmed all of our resources. Then there was the mad and often suicidal enthusiasm of the Barcelonans for abandoning their city of residence under the collective delusion, which was encouraged by the absence of municipal assistance and the odd, unscrupulous journalist that their city was the missile's next objective. In the end, the specialists' predictions turned out to be stupendously correct, as a result of which it was soon as if the city had never existed. Barcelona was one of the most difficult cities in the world to evacuate, and not 2 hours after the panic had spread, the roadways leading out had broken down irreparably. People left their cars behind and struck out on foot. The railroads were unobstructed, but there were no trains left with which to make use of them. Some tried to evacuate by sea. At first, this looked promising, but most of the ships sank, overloaded with people and possessions, and soon the port was filled with floating cadavers and debris. After 2 days, the roads leading out were still packed with anguished fugitives. But most of the population had given up on all thought of survival, and the city was left in the hands of foreigners, the poor and the desperate. There was no way to break free from the corrosive vertigo of peril without any sort of refuge. Once provisions had run out, pillage became rampant. The law of the jungle reigned. Dark gangs, armed from head to toe, roved amongst mounds of filth and wreckage. At night, all was darkness. Single lights shone forth from bonfires on the square and the occasional building set fire to. The army attempted to control the situation, but the patrols fell prey to corruption and lapsed into the same conduct as the gangs they had been ordered to combat. The only controls that functioned seamlessly were those guarding the exits, where battalions were charged with preventing the escape of anyone without means. A member of the government eventually came to that conclusion that this was the principal source of casualties, which would later be calculated as of the third day to number between 50 and 8,000. Among the survivors who weren't able to leave, the turmoil was all-encompassing. The city's infrastructure had ceased to function, and the sanitary and social disorder were aggravated by the rank disinformation being disseminated in every direction. No one knew if the risk was lesser or greater 100 meters away, or what state the world was in, and all that was distant seemed to have vanished entirely. Nothing but Barcelona's uncertain fate obsessed these people, of which I shall soon have occasion to speak. Most seemed to think it barely mattered whether a bomb fell on the city or not. 20,000 megatons, they said, couldn't make matters much worse for Barcelona. The endless suicides eased the urban bandits' ever-shrinking workload. I was part of that small, gullible group that still believed the Occident would one day raise its head once more, and I wanted to live, to satisfy my immense curiosity as to what direction things might take. So I have to say, I find that opening pretty intriguing. It's similar to the opening of the Decameron, which Boccaccio goes into detail about the effects of the plague, which causes the group of young boys and girls to gather together to tell their stories. And this one's also giving the context of what's forcing the group of characters in this book to come together to tell their stories. However, what he's really focusing on here is less the specifics of the violence of the bomb and more the specifics of the violence of ourselves, of the social breakdown that's occurring in this particular time and place. We're getting, of course, this nice opening sentence of, during the first atomic strike in its history, Barcelona became a hecatomb. What we're getting in that first sentence, aside from just the immediacy of the atomic strike, is that Barcelona became a hecatomb, which is like a way of saying it became a ritual sacrifice for the gods. Hecatomb was a word associated with Greeks and Romans, and killing oxen and other cattle for the sake of some superstitious belief of what would come after. And so we're getting this classical reference mixed in with this contemporary catastrophe. We're intertwining the horror of an atomic strike with ancient mythological frame that we're kind of moving in between. I like that as an opening sentence. I think that's really interesting. And then later in the paragraph, it seems to reveal a possible philosophical preoccupation on the part of the author, because he's thinking about the social breakdown. He says, apart from the panic and disbelief, what was most astounding was to see the way the life of the city and the country, organization and order, the dictates of custom, all the things that ordinarily appear as obligations, collapse over the course of a few days. With that moment, the social structures are revealing their contingency on normalcy, because as soon as that normalcy is broken, those very social structures, the mores of that moment, also begin to break down. It's a collapse of social obligations. So it's like a reveal of the lack of altruism on the part of so many within this society, and almost an examination of what truly binds us together. Is it our empathy and familial interest, Or is it the convenience of the normalcy that we live within that also boosts us up? And he's seemingly suggesting that as soon as the chaos erupted, so too did that inner drive for self-interest consume so many. And he speaks of it as something that was inevitable, almost. He has this description of as if we had been living over an immense pus-filled absence, simply waiting for the touch of a lancet to make it explode. And that's a really disgusting image. But what that visceral metaphor is describing is that the breakdown that we're now witnessing in the society was latent all along. It was something always about to happen. There's a kind of cynical view of human nature being revealed here in this opening paragraph. And then we have some specificity mixed in of Barcelona was one of the most difficult cities in the world to evacuate. People left their cars behind and struck out on foot. So you can imagine like just the stacks, the traffic of cars all stacked together. It kind of reminds me of like the video game The Last of Us. You just have highways filled with cars unable to move. And it's emblematic in some ways of modern society's technological dependence. We're being reminded of these things that are so daily useful that we rely on without much thought. How in this moment of complete social breakdown, all of those things actually become a hindrance to us. The convenience of a car has now transformed into the very thing that's blocking us from progressing further. Because of course, if everyone was continuing to be in tune with each other, then traffic wouldn't break down. The traffic only breaks down because someone at some point abandons their car on the road, and that blocks all the cars behind it. So it's a really nice example of how social breakdown functions. We do get a hint of the narrator at some point in this passage. We get, I was part of that small gullible group. So this isn't being told to us in like a third person omniscient view. It's an actual character in the story. I was part of that small gullible group that still believed the Occident would one day raise its head once more, and I wanted to live, to satisfy my immense curiosity as to what direction things might take. And so we have this both witness and participant of the breakdown of the society. And interestingly enough, he frames himself as not actually like emotionally attaching to what's happening. He has an intellectual curiosity. The hope that he feels comes purely from that curiosity over what's going to come next. Even in the midst of the horror, he's able to disassociate because there's something slightly fascinating about just the newness of this moment. This perspective is perhaps like an organizing consciousness that's going to be over top the nested narratives that are going to follow in the rest of the book. Just like with a lot of these openings, I'm getting just the fundamental tensions like early on. We're getting like civilization and just a fall into destruction, like society's self-destruction. We're getting a bit of hope, like intellectual hope, but also like a lack of meaning, almost like the Inviticum book. We're getting the incomprehensibility of the chaos, but also a clear rational understanding of it. It's being written and laid out to us in a way that's actually easy to follow, even though what it's describing is just supposed to be chaotic. That is, of course, maybe perhaps what so much of the book is. We're going to be getting all of these stories that are themselves isolated and could be seen chaotically. But like with Mandelbrot's recursive self-similarity of fractals, the difference all coalesces into thematic links that make it feel whole and coherent. So that's the opening of the Garden of Seven Twilights. Of the books that we've been looking at so far, I do find that opening paragraph the most intriguing. It also happens to be the longest, so maybe that gave it enough of a chance to actually like grab my attention. But I like the idea of the humans in the story needing to reconstruct meaning. And then, of course, that's perhaps why they're telling these stories to each other. That is how we reconstruct meaning, is through stories. And so maybe that's what's so much of the book is going to be about. We have a complete societal collapse, and then we have this small group of people coming together to reconstruct the meaning that is now gone. That is a pretty intriguing premise, in my view. So I'll let you know when I get around to this book if it actually ends up any good, but I really like that opening paragraph. Okay, then the next book we're going to look at is actually one that I've read before. In fact, it's, from as best as I can remember, the first serious history book I ever read, and that is Christianity by Diarmaid MacCulloch. I'm really fond of this book. I've read it twice now, but the first time it really sort of changed my sense of what history could be. And I've mentioned it in a couple of videos before, but I actually want to just look specifically at the opening because that is what grabbed my attention when I first held this book. I remember reading it. I grabbed it off the shelf. It sounded like such an interesting topic, just a broad overview of Christianity. It has this strange subtitle of the first 3,000 years, which might initially seem confusing because, of course, Jesus Christ would have only been 2,000 years ago. So the idea that it's a 3,000 year history already suggests something quite different than what is the normal way of separating out Christian history. It's really talking about the background leading into Christian history. And I remember the opening of this book really is what sealed the deal for me wanting to devote myself to reading it. And I think it sparked a love of history ever since. So I want to read the opening to you, and I do think the opening of this book communicates so much of the project that's happening here. Why begin in Greece and not in a stable in Bethlehem of Judea? Because in the beginning was the Word. The evangelist John's gospel narrative of Jesus the Christ has no Christmas stable. It opens with a chant or hymn in which word is a Greek word, logos. The Word, says John, was God, and became human flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. This logos means far more than simply word. Logos is the story itself. Logos echoes with significances which give voice to the restlessness and tension embodied in the Christian message. It means not so much a single particle of speech, but the whole act of speech, or the thought behind the speech, and from there its meanings spill outwards into conversation, narrative, musing, meaning, reason, report, rumor, even pretense. John goes on to name this Logos as a man who makes known his Father God. His name is Jesus Christ. So there we read a second Greek word, Christ. To the very ordinary Jewish name of this man, Joshua Yeshua, which has also ended up in a Greek form, Jesus, his followers added Christos as a second name after he had been executed on a cross. It is notable that they felt it necessary to make this Greek translation of a Hebrew word, Messiah or Anointed One, when they sought to describe the special foreordained character of their Joshua. In life, the carpenter's son who died on the cross would certainly have known Greek speakers well, but they were the folks in the town down the road from his own Jewish hometown of Nazareth. Other people, not his people. The name Christ underlines the importance of Greek culture from the earliest days of Christianity, as Christians struggled to find out what their message was and how the message should be proclaimed. So the words Logos and Christos tell us what a tangle of Greek and Jewish ideas and memories underlies the construction of Christianity. I still love that opening. It immediately decenters the traditional Christian origin narratives. It starts with Greece rather than Judea. By zooming in on the language, it's really using the language as a proxy for the stems of influence that have spread throughout Christian history. He's emphasizing how the faith was shaped by more than its traditional self-understanding. It didn't exist in isolation. Just like the first book that we covered in this video, it's a network of influences that are occurring. And we have the Word, says John, was God, and became human flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. So he's engaging with the primary text while simultaneously analyzing their historical context. And he says this Logos means far more than simply word. Logos is the story itself. Logos echoes with significances which give voice to the restlessness and tension embodied in the Christian method. Right here, we're getting an establishment of McCulloch's interpretive framework, how he's viewing Christianity as inherently containing internal contradictions and tensions with other influences and cultures, how it's as much part of the Jewish tradition as it is part of the Greek tradition, as it is something that branches out later on. He says, it is notable that they felt it necessary to make this Greek translation of a Hebrew word, Messiah, or Anointed One, when they sought to describe the special foreordained character of their Joshua. And so this is another key theme that's being established. Where Christianity's spread involved processes of linguistic and cultural translation. Like it just has to continuously be embedded within the space and time and culture that it's in. It's a hybrid identity from its very earliest moments. So already in this first page, we're getting just a totally different framing of how Christianity came to be. Something not perfectly clean and segmented, but rather fully engaging with the world. We have the name Christ underlines the importance of Greek culture from the earliest days of Christianity, as Christians struggled to find out what their message was and how the message should be proclaimed. So we have Christians' inherently cross-cultural origins. It talks about how they struggled to find out what their message was and how the message should be proclaimed, because the message is something that is crossing various barriers. And that is always the struggle of Christianity, is it's like trying to teach this universal message, but then being forced to localize it again and again. And through that process of localization, it is changing entirely. It's becoming something completely distinctive. And one of the best things about this history book, when you actually read through it, is he really is talking about how Christianity was always separate. It was never just one unified thing from its very, very, very beginnings. It was immediately branching out into various, now, I guess you could say, marginalized traditions. The Nestorian or Ethiopian or Armenian branches of Christianity, which were there fairly early on. This book actually offers a lot of that concrete detail of how much Christianity was spreading in different ways, and the message was diluted instantaneously. And then to go back to the text, we have, so the words logos and Christos tell us what a tangle of Greek and Jewish ideas and memories underlies the construction of Christianity. So we get through this opening paragraph the methodological approach that will guide the rest of the work. He's going to be exploring Christianity as a complex cultural construction, not just words from on high. It is a human affair. Because it is so human, we're going to be getting a vast intersection of multiple intellectual traditions kind of feeding into each other. And that begins with language. It began with the word. I love the parallel to the actual traditional book of Genesis. Beginning with the word, it's not just the beginning of the spiritual text, it's literally the beginning of the spiritual tradition. It is language spreading. It's ideas spreading with words, with language. And because it's spreading that way, it's always going to be adapting and shifting. Language is not consistent in the ways that would be convenient. It's much more rather contextual, again and again and again. So I like that in the outset of this Christianity book. And having read the book, I can tell you that it definitely lives up to the frame that he's setting up. He really takes seriously that constant diverging quality of the Christian history. I think it's an excellent first history book, even though I remember when I initially read it, there were so many names I didn't know yet because I hadn't read a lot of history prior to that point. And so, you will have to be looking up a lot of names to understand things, but I do think what you'll gain from the book is a really nice, straightforward way in to the way that looking at history complexifies things. It does not simplify. That there isn't really a simple way to go through history. It's going to be one of those things where when you accumulate more and more detail, what you discover is that history is not a straight line. There's so many branches in any tradition. The book, Christianity, is a great introduction to that kind of historical reality. Now I want to veer back into fiction, but in particular, like some really strange fiction. There's this author, John Cowper Powys, who writes in this weird kind of mystical, spiritual frame where everything is ontologically object-oriented in its subjectivity, where every object in the space of the setting of the story has like a kind of souledness that is like pushing out into the world. And the whole universe has this constant subjectivity to it. It's a very weird writing style. And so I kind of want to read the opening paragraph of this book just to introduce this unusual writer to a lot of you. So the book that I'm going to read from is A Glastonbury Romance. And again, the author is John Cowper Powys. I'll just dive right in. I think you'll get the strangeness of his style. This particular book opens with one of the weirdest sentences. At the striking of noon on a certain 5th of March, There occurred within a causal radius of Brandon Railway Station and yet beyond the deepest pools of emptiness between the uttermost stellar systems, one of those infinitesimal ripples in the creative silence of the first cause, which always occur when an exceptional stir of heightened consciousness agitates any living organism in this astronomical universe. Something passed at that moment. A wave, a motion, a vibration, too tenuous to be called magnetic, too subliminal to be called spiritual, between the soul of a particular human being who was emerging from a third-class carriage of the 1219 train from London and the divine diabolic soul of the first cause of all life. You probably got the spiritual focus of this author with this word first cause. Immediately from the outset, he's connecting the otherwise mundane modernity of a railway station to the first cause of the entire universe. It has this feeling like your mind is traveling from the most small and insignificant of spaces to the most sublime in a single sentence. And again, it says, at the striking of noon on a certain 5th of March, there occurred. And this is really the part of the sentence that actually matters, because it's such a long opening sentence, it's almost actively confusing when you first read it. But really the whole sentence is, there occurred one of those infinitesimal ripples. And that's really the whole sentence. But then surrounding there occurred one of those infinitesimal ripples is all of this description of what that occurrence signifies. So there occurred within a causal radius of Brandon Railway Station, again, that mundane modernity, and yet beyond the deepest pools of emptiness between the uttermost stellar systems, one of those infinitesimal ripples. So it repeats twice this radial view of what is the setting. The causal radius of Brandon Railway Station, and yet beyond the deepest pools of emptiness between the uttermost stellar systems. So we go from small, immediately jolted, into the big, and then it continues the sentence. There occurred one of those infinitesimal ripples in the creative silence of the first cause, which always occurs when an exceptional stir of heightened consciousness agitates any living organism in this astronomical universe. It's just completely bonkers, the direction this sentence goes. We're going to start with the railway station, just pure drab, and then we're going to go to the exceptional stir of heightened consciousness, how it agitates any living organism in this astronomical universe. And I like that word, agitates. It's like shaking up, like the vibration, but agitates is typically like a negative connotation. But it's the stir of heightened consciousness that is giving life through this kind of violent shaking of any living organism in this astronomical universe. And it's immediately introducing the novel's metaphysical fixations. And that's what remains straining throughout the whole of the prose of this novel, is just this utter ridiculous devotion to consciousness as a force in the world that the author is always contending with. It's almost in spite of the story. And it makes for these really unusual descriptions throughout the whole book. This idea, too, of first cause is also indicating the weirdly Christian mythological interweaving with the philosophical metaphysics of that zooming out and seeing everything from afar. The nice thing is, even though it has that kind of Christian tinge to it, it's a very readable book for someone who doesn't have any of that inclination like myself, because it just allows for a different kind of beautiful, sublime eagerness to the writing. It makes it so that the author has a constant devotional feel for the text that he's writing. And that is exciting, just to have that passion in the writing be so continuous and ongoing. After we are given this super long, potentially confusing opening sentence, we're then given this somewhat clarifying second sentence. Something passed at that moment. A wave, a motion, a vibration, too tenuous to be called magnetic, too subliminal to be called spiritual. We're given a sequence of near synonyms back to back in that second sentence. A wave, a motion, a vibration. It's attempting to define the ineffable. It's showing immediately how to try to capture transcendence through language is to immediately fail, and to fail again and again, because there's always going to be a limitation. beyond language in the broader transcendent claim. That's sort of the feel, right? That feeling of you fully losing yourself is really you losing any kind of delineation that language would otherwise comfort us with. And so already we just have these back-to-back synonyms. It's like the inexplicability of this feeling that this author is trying to convey. And then between the soul of a particular human being, so all of this is happening between the soul of a particular human being who was emerging from a third-class carriage, now we're brought back down into the world, of the 1219 train, and notice that specificity in the world, from London, and the divine diabolic soul of the first cause of all life. So this moment is in between the extremity of the soul of the first cause of all life and the minutia of this small little 1219 train from London. And we have the juxtaposition there of the mundane with the cosmic, and we have this like interpretation of human experience as always being interconnected with something way beyond itself. And this is probably a bit much, but there's also this divine diabolic soul. And I like how it's not falling back into like a simple moral category. It's not saying that it is a pure good, this first cause. It has that little hint of cynicism. This is not on purpose, but it almost feels like cynicism is like ringing through again and again through a lot of the books in this video. But this cynicism of divine diabolic, it's not human-centered in its moral justice. It's rather something that is as evil as it is good, this first cause being referenced. And that emphasizes a purely ambiguous spirituality being displayed here. So there was like this Christian notion that one could gather from this concept of this first cause divine, but then there's this more spread out spiritual view of no, it doesn't need to fit into that little box. It is divine and diabolic at once. All of this, just from the very first small paragraph, immediately establishes the framework for how the novel will explore individual psychology and community dynamics alongside this perpetual cosmic force in the midst of everything. Just always there, always ongoing, like a paradoxical joining of the intensely local with the universal. Just like that first book we were looking at. I'm actually running out of time. I picked out 10 books to cover. I spent so much time talking about each one that I've now wasted my time. I've missed my chance. So I'm going to have to record again some other time. So maybe I'll just do a sequel to this video, and I'll put the link to the sequel, I guess, in the comments when I make it. So this is the end of this one, and I'll get to a second one as soon as I can, and I'll cover some more big books and talk line by line if you guys are interested and that kind of thing. I kind of worry that this might be too zoomed in on the text for people's interest, but maybe there was at least one interesting thing that I said throughout this whole thing. In fact, actually, I'm going to end with one more quote. I hope to at least share it a little bit more with you guys. And this is going to be the end of the video, and I'll see you guys in part 2 whenever I make it, and in whatever other video I make when I make it. Thanks so much for watching. Here's this other quote from the Glastonbury romance. "The wind was sharp indeed as they crossed these two big meadows, but there was a faint fragrance of sap-filled grass in the air, and the sun was hot. Mary's ecstasy of mood increased rather than diminished as she walked by John's side, following his step with her step, and even picking up a stick from the ground as she went along. This she did with the conscious desire to have some sensation of her own exactly parallel to that which her cousin enjoyed as he pressed the end of his stick into the ground. Mary felt that everything she looked at was bathed in a liquid mist, and yet was seen by her for the first time in its real essence. It seemed to her that the souls of all living things flung forth their inmost nature that day in a magical rapture. All things seemed anxious to let all other living things realize how they loved them. As for herself, she felt she could have stroked with her bare fingers everything she looked at. The very wind, so keen, so bitter, that now blew in her face and tugged at her clothes, even towards it she felt a sort of tenderness. She seemed to divine that it felt itself to be hated by all the human beings it encountered, and she longed to disabuse it of this mistake." And I just wanted to read that paragraph because it sort of sums up the constant personification of natural elements that is occurring in this book. I hope to share more books with you next time. Really, the purpose of this channel is just to introduce great books to you. So I hope that you found some of this compelling, and I'll see you guys around.